In this session now, we want to focus on the persecution of our Anabaptist forebears. And I always find this a sobering time, partly because of my own cowardice about pain, also because of the comfort and safety in which we live in America. And when I read scriptures like Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, when he said, "Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven." Frankly, I don't know experientially what that means. Really. And I doubt if you do. Before going to Sudan, a number of people at the church would ask me, "Are you sure it's safe to go over there?" I said, "No." The airplane could go down for one thing, but they were asking about the political situation and the fact that it's a very closed culture, very closed country, and a police state basically. And so I had asked Yasser, "What are the risks?" He said, "Well, the worst that would happen is if the security police would get wind of our meetings and would crash a meeting and find Muslims there. And in the last meeting, they'd have found more Muslims than Christians. There were about 75 Christians, and there were about 225 people. But anyway, he said if they would find Muslims there, then they would arrest the leadership. You would probably spend the night in jail," he said, "and be on the first plane out toward America, being immediately deported." I said, "Well, I can handle that." And there would not be any real threat of long imprisonment, or torture, but just get rid of this guy, And I could handle that. I'm sure God would give grace for worse than that. But what Jesus said there about rejoicing in persecution, being exceeding glad, in America, we don't really have opportunity to test that. But I have watched several videos, just home video kinds of things, done by Westerners who were in the underground church meetings in China. One was a former student at Rosedale. And I saw things that convinced me that if we are faithful in the context in which we live, with all of our protections, constitutional protections for the freedom of religion, if we're faithful in that context, then should I say if, or should I say when, those freedoms are lost, we will experience grace just as they do in countries where they are persecuted. And I saw a Chinese pastor who had just gotten out of about the second or third imprisonment under hard labor, a re-education camp under communist rule, with a lot of hard labor. Give a report to the Christians. Of course, it was in Mandarin, and I couldn't understand it, but it was translated roughly then afterward. What he was telling them was reporting how that when he got into prison and began to share the gospel with fellow prisoners, and I think he was in there something like 9 years. By the time he got out, there were 20-some believers in the church in prison. And there would have been more, except that some of them got released and went out to spread the gospel some more, And he was beaming when he reported that. And I sat there thinking, it would take a lot of grace. But I do believe the Lord would give it to us. And Paul said something even more troubling when he said, yea, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. I don't know how that's fleshed out in a republic like ours. I really don't know. But I do believe that the Lord does give us tests, sometimes right in our own churches, where he may ask something of us in our conscience that is not the practice of the larger group, and may not need to be. But the question is, will we follow the Lord? I'm convinced he does check to see what the level of our commitment to him is. But our forefathers didn't have to wonder about that question. You'll see there on the transparency that it was the Catholics, the Reformed, and the Lutheran churches who all three persecuted each other that were persecuting us. I think you'll soon see anyway on the transparency. And I've mentioned before that it was actually the magistrates who carried out the recommendations and the judgments of the clergy. It was clergymen who did the testing of our forebears, the trials, and came up with the verdicts having to do with whether or not we are heretics. And when we were declared to be heretics back then, they would recommend a sentence and turn the victims over to, the convicted, they would turn them over to the magistrates. And Leonard Verdwin says in his book, The Reformers and Their Stepchildren, which is about us Anabaptists calling us stepchildren, he said there that by that step of sophistry, where the magistrates would carry out the executions and so on, the church thought she could keep the blood of the martyrs off her skirts. But the magistrates were members of the church and basically servants of the church. They were the second sword in the two swords theory of Augustine. And I've made a list here of some of the extent, some of the parameters of the era of persecution, and then some discussion of the methods of persecution and torture and execution. And like I was saying at the end of the other session, that I'd want you to come into this session with a certain sense of sobriety about what our forefathers went through and what could very well happen in the lifetime of some of you younger ones here today, maybe even middle-aged. Probably won't happen in my lifetime. I don't know how long I'll live, of course, but there is a growing disgust, at least, with Bible-believing Christians, and there is a growing disdain for biblical morality and ethics. When the Creation Museum opened there in Cincinnati, about 120 miles from our house, which that's plenty close, so we haven't gotten there yet. But we want to go, and we'll go one of these days, Lord willing. But when that opened, the Columbus Dispatch carried a number of responses or reactions to it. And a teacher of high school science wrote a scathing denunciation of the Answers in Genesis organization and said it should be against the law in America to so blatantly lie to young people as to suggest that the cosmos did not come about by evolution and that life did not spontaneously emerge in an evolutionary process. And the paper printed it. Rush Limbaugh says a lot that I don't agree with, and I would answer the question that I was asked one time, do Christians listen to Rush? Do Anabaptists listen to Rush? Well, Rush gushes quite a bit, but I would agree with him that this far. I heard him say one day, I generally hear him only when I'm traveling and need to stay awake. But, and he has a way of doing that. But I heard him say one day that liberals, and he was speaking of theological liberals, are the most intolerant people. And I'm tempted to think that probably carries over into the religious as well, that they tend to be intolerant. And it could very well happen. I don't say this prophetically with any sense of urgency from the Lord, except for us to test our hearts, of course. But based on what has happened in my lifetime, I can imagine that over the next generation, and considering 3 generations per century, that's 33 years, in the next generation, the America we know now may radically change. And we may find ourselves in circumstances not unlike our forebears did, and Christians in some other countries are now. Our first martyr back in the 16th century was actually either Bolt Eberly or Eberly Bolt. I remember asking the late J.C. Wenger, because both those names are family names and first names, Bolt and Eberly. And I said, was it Bolt Eberly or Eberly Bolt? He said, yes. So we don't know. So that doesn't matter. But in a little town in Switzerland called Schwyz, and those of you who are Pennsylvania Dutch speakers know that that means sweat. Hard-working bunch there, I suppose. They were Catholics. They killed Bolt Eberly in the summer of 1525. That was early. And the Catholics were both first to do it, to make it a capital offense to be a heretic in the Anabaptist vein, but also then Reformed and Lutheran. But the Reformed and Lutheran groups followed. And while they were not quite as vicious, and they did not have the machinery or history of the Inquisition as did the Catholic Church, yet all 3 of these churches did persecute us. And in the course of the first about 20 years, when it was the most vicious, it is estimated that approximately 2,000 Anabaptists were martyred. We don't know that number very exactly, partly because the demographics were not without a lot of blanks, the statistics. And in some jurisdictions, they did not record them by design. They didn't want that sordid a record in their books. Plus, they did deputize many men to be Anabaptist hunters, they were called, or Baptist hunters. The literal translation would be Baptist hunters, Teufel, Jäger. Jäger is the German for hunter. And so they would deputize men who were willing, for a price, to keep a watchful eye for anyone suspicioned of heresy. And one of the more sad and poignant accounts of the function and involvement of a Teufeljäger, an Anabaptist hunter, and they were authorized or deputized and authorized to kill if there was an attempt to escape while they were arresting or transporting someone. And so we don't know how many were killed by Teufeljäger, by Anabaptist hunters. But in this one case in southern Austria, kind of on the east end of what is called the Austrian Tyrol, in a little town called Wald, which is German for forest, in that little town called Forest, which is just west of the modern-day Mittersill, there were two young Anabaptist men who arrived at the local, what we'd now call a motel, where they could leave their horses and have them cared for. They could get a meal and could sleep there overnight. And when their meal came, there were men there from the local area. So this tradition, men, goes way back, that local men would gather in the local eatery and eat meals and chew the fat, as it were, and solve the world's problems. Well, anyway, there were some of those in that little restaurant motel in Wald, and one of them was a Teufeljäger, an Anabaptist hunter. And when the meal was brought out to these two young Anabaptist men, they bowed their heads to pray before they ate. And immediately he was suspicious, because most of the Protestants and Catholics in public didn't pray before they ate. So he went over and asked them, "Have you been rebaptized?" They said no. He asked a few other questions that they could answer without incriminating themselves. But when he knew what to ask, when he asked the right questions, they went silent. He arrested them on the spot, did not allow them to eat their supper, had their horses brought out and his horse, got them on their horses, tied their ankles to the stirrups and their wrists behind their backs, and led their horses in trail about 11 kilometers west to Schloss Mittersill, which would be the castle that was the summer residence of the Catholic bishop. And in that castle, there was an underground dungeon. After World War II, that castle came into a hunter's lodge. A hunter's group bought it for a while, and then they sold it, put it on the market, and it was bought by the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and it was operated by them. I think it still is. About 8-10 years ago, we tried again to get into that castle, but they were full the weekend we wanted to be there. But our family spent a week there at the castle. I think it was about the second day we were there, I said to the manager, I said, "I'm told there is a a dungeon somewhere here in this castle? He said, yes, there is. And he said, you want a challenge? See if you can find it. And my 3 sons and I went through that castle with a fine-tooth comb, and we didn't find it. And he said that wasn't really fair, but we had fun doing it anyway. He said, because it's right in the entryway, under the sleigh, which is on a carpet that was well hid. We had lifted the edge of the carpet, saw nothing, but you had to actually move the sleigh and then roll up the carpet, and right under the sleigh, between the 2 runners, was this square opening about that big. A wedge kind of opening with a ring in it. And he got us a rod, and we put it through the ring and lifted that big rock out of the opening, and got a flashlight and a step ladder. And my sons and I went down into that dungeon. It was probably about 5 feet high. You couldn't stand up straight. It had a dirt floor. It was damp. Had quite a few spider webs in it, cobwebs. I hate spiders. But we went in there, and I just talked about what would it have been like. Those 2 young men were in there. And then we lose the trail. We don't know what happened to them. Did they escape, or were they in prison for a while and then were released, or were they killed? We don't know that story, unfortunately. But just to be taken there at night, tired and hungry, and put into that damp, cold dungeon. We had them put the lid back on for just a few minutes. And I have a pretty bad case of claustrophobia, so it wasn't very long. I'd have needed a lot of grace to not start screaming. And screaming men are not attractive. But those men spent who knows how much time in there. And sometimes they would fill those dungeons as tight as they could pack them in. And you can imagine the discomfort, the smells, the awful experience that people had in those kinds of experiences. Martyrdom did end about the mid-16th century. There were not many martyrdoms in the, 17th century, 1600s. There were not many martyrdoms in the 17th century, but there were some. And the estimated total does vary. I've seen estimations as low as 1,500, but that, in my estimation, is way low. But somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. I used to think there might be more, but I've lowered that estimation. That somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 probably were martyred. Galley slavery, however, where healthy men were sentenced to serve on galleys, where they would row the Mediterranean boats, because the Mediterranean is known to have a lot of calms where sails won't work for propulsion. And so they had these rows of rowers and oars on the sides, and it made them a lot faster even when they had wind. And so they would buy healthy men as either criminals or political or religious prisoners, and buy them up, put them on these galleys to row these boats. And they did not understand the common sailors' problems like scurvy and things like that. And a sentence to galley slavery was almost certainly a sentence to death. Because even while they weren't martyred as such, they would become sick, and if they were so sick that they couldn't row anymore, They were just kind of thrown in the corner, were not taken care of, weren't fed, and they would die in their illness and their bodies be thrown overboard. The galley slavery came as late as 1750. Now that's a long time, 225 years after the movement began, and from here back, now only 258 years. So it's almost halfway between the beginnings and now. And the last one that we're aware of that's recorded, there were actually about 87 or 88 men and boys who were sentenced in a large gathering in of men, of Anabaptists, and they imprisoned these and sold the healthy ones to boat owners along the seashore. And I'm not sure now of the town, and I've been trying to find, for some while, I've been trying to find this account again, and I have not been able to come up with it. But I do remember that there were just under 90 men sentenced to the galleys. And the magistrates did decide that the morning when they started marching them from where they were in prison to march them down to the seashore, to sell them, to deliver them there to the buyers, that they allowed the families, wives and sisters and so on, to come and say goodbye to them. And the account said that it was such an emotional parting that even the guards who were assigned to deliver them to the buyers wept. And the first night, they all escaped. Probably the guards wanted them to. They all got back home and vanished. I mean, they moved out of the area. And then the public reaction was so strong that they quit persecuting at that point in that particular jurisdiction. So there were those kinds of things happening very late, but there was more and more opposition to persecution on the part of Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran laymen, and even churchmen, who took the position that we should not persecute those who simply have a different belief than we do. And that was one of the good things that came out of that. Full toleration, in most cases where historians have done the research on this, and I'm banking on other research other than my own for this, claim that first the full toleration first came in Switzerland, which was a bit more liberal, in 1815. But, pardon me, in Holland it was more liberal. There it came before 1800, about 1798, where they even stopped charging them what was called Teufeltoll, or Baptist taxes, where many jurisdictions allowed Anabaptists to settle there and farm some of the more marginal land, and they had already, by that late date, 1790s, they had become the quiet in the land and had lost their evangelistic fervor, and were now more concerned about being free from persecution. So they would go into areas that would invite them to come under these circumstances, that they would farm the marginal land and they would have to pay a tax, so much per head of everyone in a household, the parents and the children and grandparents and so on. So that kind of thing happened, and the taxing of Anabaptists supposedly ended before the turn of the 19th century in Holland, and into the 19th century, about 1815 in Switzerland. However, in my own research, when I was in Switzerland, I was directed to a man by the name of Samuel Gerber, who back in 1977, he was 75. He was born in 1902. And of course, in 77, I was quite a bit younger than I am now, 31 years younger. And I thought he was old, and he wasn't as healthy as I am. But he was thrilled to talk about what he had learned about Anabaptist history, and especially persecution. And he told me, when I told him that the sources I've read suggest that in Switzerland, there was total freedom from persecution by 1815. He said, no way. I said, what is the evidence? Do you have good evidence that that was too early to say they had total toleration, full toleration? He said, definitely. They were not allowed to meet in groups larger than, I think, 20 until about the middle 19th century, 1850. And he said the Anabaptist tax may have stopped about 1815. But he said his grandfather, who was living when he was a young boy, which let's say would have been around 1906, 7, 8, he thought, in that time frame, his grandfather, who was in his 70s, would have been born in 1830. And he remembered that they could not meet in large groups when he was a youngster. But then it soon happened that they could meet wherever they wanted to. And then he took us to a place that his grandfather told him that his father said they used to meet in secret, called the Teufelbrücke, the Baptist Bridge, up in the hills. But then he smiled, and I knew something was coming. He said, really, when it comes to full toleration, in 1941, during World War II, a Reformed landowner asked a Mennonite to farm his land. It was down in the valley and under 1,000 meters in elevation. And this farmer knew the Reformed farmer that had been farming for him, and the landowner had fired him, didn't like his farming, and he asked the Mennonite to farm his land. And the Mennonite said, well, I don't want to do that because I know this man, and he will be very unhappy with me. The Reformed landowner said, I fired him, and he won't get to farm it, regardless who would farm it. He will not get to farm it. I want you to farm it. So he went and talked to the man, and the former farmer, and the former farmer became very angry with him and reminded him that it's against the law for you to farm land under 1,000 meters in elevation. The Mennonite didn't know that, but he just knew that all the Mennonites lived on the higher ground, up in the hills, and the good flat land in the valley in what is called the Sonnenberg area, the Zunenberg. The Sonnenberg Mennonite Church in Ohio is from that region. He said he knew they lived up in the higher elevations, but he didn't know it was actually on the books. He went and checked it out, and then he told the landowner, I can't farm your land because it's against the law. And it was still on the books. Mennonites may not own or farm land under 1,000 meters elevation. So, and this was 1941. So the landowner went to the city fathers and got him a lawyer. And anyway, this came to a public hearing where they were to decide whether in that jurisdiction this law is one of those blue laws that should be ignored or if it should be enforced. And of course, the former farmer was there and argued for its enforcement. And the landowner argued for its demise. And the city fathers and their lawyer ruled, the judge ruled to negate the law. And so he said within a decade, the valley was full of Mennonites farming the valley land, because a lot of the landowners wanted the Mennonites to farm it, and now they knew they could do it without any hassle. So he said, really, we just got full toleration in 1941. Well, that wasn't really persecution. It was just a little glitch in their freedom, I suppose. But those are some of the parameters. But let's look at the methods used for persecution here. Banishment from an area that happened almost immediately after the movement was born. George Blaurock, who was not himself a Zuricher, but was living in Zurich, he was whipped and told never to return to Zurich. They felt like they couldn't go ahead and martyr him at the same time they killed Mons, who was a Zuricher, and they couldn't find, at that point, they couldn't find Conrad Grebel. And Grebel was in hiding in his sister and brother-in-law's place and died there of the plague. But they whipped Blaurock and banished him from Zurich. And that happened to a lot of Anabaptists. And often with that went the confiscation of any properties they had. And they had a very clever way of enticing people to turn in their neighbors or even family members if they were suspicious of heresy, because they were given a percentage of the confiscated property. Can you imagine the effectiveness of that in Swiss German people who tend to be, what's the word, covetous? I don't suppose there's any nationality who doesn't, but we sure do. I'm Swiss in origin from my Beachy side, German from the Miller side, and I know that my heart, my carnal heart, could be tempted with that kind of thing, and it was a very effective tool. Imprisonment was very, very common. Some of the men spent long terms in prison in those jurisdictions where they were a bit loath to kill, to actually martyr people. And so they would be a bit more apt to just put them in prison over long periods of time. And that happened, for instance, to Peter Riedmann, who was the theologian of the Hutterite movement. He lived, I think, 27 years after his conversion to Anabaptism, but spent about 18 of those years in prison and 9 years in freedom. So it was a very different kind of experience than what we would be aware of from our exposure to any pressures from the outside. But the methods of torture is where it just really gets to us. They were ruthless in their torture. But even as we think about that, I would just remind us that the inhumanity of man to man has not improved just because of our education and sophistication in the 21st century. We have more clever and technological ways to do it, but we are just as inhumane, potentially and actually, today as they were then. But they had some awesome and awful and terrible ways to extract recantations from people who had wandered from the accepted theology of whichever group it was, Protestant or Catholic. Now, the Catholics had the advantage in the 16th century of having about 400 years of experience with the Inquisition And they had devised particular methods and tools of torture. A variation on the same theme was to have a rack, which was just a flat table, a long enough table that you could put a person's ankles into stocks or into straps, fastened to ropes that went around a drum with a ratchet on it. And at the other end, his wrists would be fastened onto the rack so that it would not move, could not move. And then they'd tighten up notch by notch from the ankles and stretch the person out to where he could just barely, with his strength, keep his shoulders or hips in joint. And then they would warn him, if you'd recant, we'll relax the pressure. If you don't, we will increase it. And dislocated shoulders, dislocated hips are extremely painful. And they would ratchet them up until they would have dislocation. And sometimes they would actually go into shock and nearly lose consciousness. And in fact, in the case of Hans Hut, they had racked him in Augsburg, and not Augsburg, forget the Austrian town now where he was imprisoned, and they racked him until he went unconscious, and then threw him back into his cell on a damp straw tick with a lantern in the cell. And the lantern tipped over onto the tick and actually lit it, but the straw was too damp to burn. It just smoldered. And when they next came to find him, he had suffocated in the smoke of his own tick where he was sleeping or where he was lying unconscious. He had passed out on the rack without recanting, and that happened to others. But a variation on that was where the Inquisition had used this, and this was primarily a Catholic tool, but it was also in some cases used by the Protestants, because a jurisdiction that went from Catholic to Protestant also held the same territory and had some of these tools of the Inquisition at their disposal. So another variation of that was that on a high wall, it would have had to have been higher than this ceiling, but on a high wall they would put a drum with a brake and a rope on it, and they could release the brake and bring the rope down and tie a man's wrists behind his back, and then warn him that they're going to lift him up on that drum by his wrists behind his back. And most men were strong enough to make themselves stiff and be lifted up, but then they were warned, they knew ahead of time, they would release the brake and then hit the brake. And they'd drop part way and hit the brake, and then the arms would come around from the back and wrench their shoulders, tear the ligaments and the muscles. And when that happened, they were crippled for life if they lived. But they did that. That kind of just really inhumane thing to induce fear and hopefully produce recantation. Or even another variation on that was hanging. And you'll see hanging here under torture. Well, you can't hang by the neck and be tortured because you don't last long. That's execution. But they would, and there's a picture in the Martyr's Mirror, a bit like this picture here, that shows a man hanging by his wrists like this, and weights attached to his ankles, and a couple soldiers or deputies playing with dice at his feet, waiting until his joints went out, while he hung there trying to hang on by his muscular strength. But in a moment of weakness or cramping, the weights would win, and the terrible excruciating pain of dislocated shoulders and joints, otherwise hips usually, would just drive the person to tremendous pain. Talking about grace to suffer, I do take courage from this. There are several extant letters from persons who were tortured, who were able to write letters out to churches and or families, loved ones, and their testimony was that the torture was not as bad as they anticipated. That God gave grace even for the torture, to where what they anticipated to be an almost intolerable pain. And everyone has a pain threshold where we pass out. They would experience either that or in other ways found that the torture was not as bad as their anticipation of it had been. There was also this thing of beating people with either rods or chains, that kind of thing. Just anything to induce a lot of pain and to make the anticipation of it be what would drive the person to recanting. And they would beat them with chains, with whips, and with rods, and sometimes to unconsciousness. Then the block was another Catholic Inquisition invention, where they took a very heavy timber and mortised two arms into it at an angle, and you'd lay the person on that and strap their wrists down on the block, on these arms that extended from the main timber, and also had a belt around the middle, and then at your ankles they would fasten you down. And they'd warn you ahead of time that if you don't recant, they're going to break your bones. And they'd take this big wooden mallet, kind of a dull-pointed wooden mallet, and they'd usually start at the shin bones, the lower bones of the leg, and break the bones there on both legs. If there was no repentance, they would break the lower arm bones and both arms. If there was still no recantation, they would break the upper leg bones and then the upper arms. And usually by the time that all four limbs had been broken that way, 8 major fractures, people went into shock, and a goodly number died on the block. You'll see that it's listed under execution as well as torture. It was intended as a means of torture, but became also a means of execution by default. They didn't understand shock and things like that back then, and so people died after so much trauma was inflicted upon their bodies. They would take the tongs and other tools of the blacksmith and turn them into tools of torture. Even after they weren't killing preachers in every case, they would silence preachers by pulling out their tongues as far as they could, and they'd take these wide tongs that blacksmiths used to hold red-hot material when they were shaping it. They'd make those tongs red-hot, slide them in over the tongue as far back as they could, and then just squeeze down on it and just burn the tongue off. Pinch and burn it off. And that cauterizing with the red-hot tongs stopped the bleeding as it went. And you'd wind up with just a stub of a tongue in the back of your mouth. And sometimes they'd take a big red-hot awl and shove it through both cheeks and just work it back and forth, and burn a big hole in both cheeks so that a preacher could not raise his voice and speak loudly anymore. Just anything to induce pain. One of the more senseless ones was in the case of Michael Sattler, which I didn't mention in the previous session, that on the way to execution, 7 times they took red-hot tongs and plucked flesh from his body. One of their favorite things, of course, was the genitals, but also other areas where they would simply take red-hot tongs and pinch a part of the body, twist and pull, and take it off. And Sattler 7 times took that and still told his fellows, I will lift my hand to bear witness to God's grace, to die in the fire. They would cut, well, the screws, I didn't mention those. In some jurisdictions where they had little tools, very few tools, if any, for torture, something as simple as tying a person's hands down with the fingers out where they couldn't move, and take a screw and just turn it in under the fingernails. That's a very sensitive part of the body, and you could imagine the pain that that kind of thing would cause. And cutting, where they would cut parts of the body, and again in sensitive places and so on. Hunger, where they'd put them in prison, tell them they'll only get bread and water and very little of that until they die or recant. And some did die that way, not many that we know of, because sometimes they were later executed or did escape. And sensual temptations, where they would actually take lewd women and put them in with a man with the intention of tempting him to indiscretion or sin. And there's not one known case where it worked. And in one case, they also took some Anabaptist men and women who were not married to each other, that we know of in that case, but they stripped them all nude and put them all together in one cell and hoped that some indiscretion would happen there. And again, there is not one known case. And you can be sure that the anger with which the authorities dealt with our forebears, had there been such a failure, they would have made the most of it. And so apparently that never did succeed. One of the saddest, one of the things that makes me feel the most empathetic toward this young couple, a young couple with one little child, a little baby, was arrested and imprisoned. And a few days after the imprisonment, the man in his cell heard what he thought was his baby, and it was his baby, and his wife. The baby's crying, and the wife is nearly crying and begging that he recant, saying that she has recanted and agreed to go back to the state church. And if he would recant, they would release him as well, and we could go home. But what really happened was they got a woman who was a good what's the word I want? A good imposter, where she could make it sound like she was the wife, and she went into the prison cell with the wife and talked with her until she knew how to sound like this woman, and then took the baby, and the baby was crying because the baby was with a strange woman, And so with a crying baby standing down the hall from the cell, she faked being his wife and said she had recanted and tried to get him to recant. I've wondered what I would have done. But he didn't. And Jesus did say we must love him more than husband or wife or father or mother or houses or lands. And he did find out later that it was an impostor. She had not recanted. That story ends more happily than many. They did get their freedom later and did survive that time of execution and torture. When it comes to the executions, just a few moments to think about the burning at the stake or in big bonfires where they were pole vaulted in. Sometimes when they were quite merciful, they pour quite a bit of pitch over the person's head and put gunpowder in a bag around the neck so that when the fire came up to the gunpowder and would ignite it, it would snuff the person's life out quickly. Beheading with axes or swords, drowning, hanging by the neck, not often but a few times, or just being thrust through while at the stake with a sword. That sort of thing happened. And the block, as I've mentioned before. I would like at this point just to have us pause to pray and to think about what our forebears endured and what about us. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, if we know our hearts, we do love you for so great a gift of salvation. But as we contemplate, think about what our forebears went through and what could be similar circumstances in our future, we pray for grace both to honestly assess our own hearts and grace to be true even unto death. Thank you for hearing our prayer. Amen. God bless you good. Look forward to seeing you then in the next session.